Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Rising Network. My name is Lily, and I'm the founder of the Rising Network. And a warm welcome to today's online masterclass, Do Less and Lead More, with Hilary McLellan, who is the founder of Indigo Talent Development. And Hilary is an organizational behaviorist, executive, and team coach with extensive experience in leadership development, authenticity, resilience, and emotional intelligence. And Hilary also has a background in HR. I'm really excited about today's session, where you will learn how to gain a deeper understanding of your critical self and your compassionate self, and why these are important. And also, you'll learn more about emotional intelligence, psychological safety, and compassionate leadership, and how they can help you become the best version of you. I'd now like to hand over to Hilary.
Thank you so much, Lily. I'm new to the Rising Network, everyone, so it's really, although I had the most amazing conversation with Lily before I joined, that's really sort of helped shape the purpose, etc., of the organisation. Right, I'm just going to keep my brain in gear and make sure I press the right buttons, because that's always helpful. So, it's lovely to be here. Thank you so much for showing an interest, I guess, to start with. So yeah, Hilary McLellan, do less and lead more. It's an interesting heading. But it resonates with a lot of what I'm finding out there in my job, but also just in life, actually. So while Lily was quite right, I am an executive coach, and I'm also an organisational behaviourist, which is, and I do come from a long background of HR, but people see me now, and when I go out and speak, you know, they just kind of think, well, that's who she is, a professional woman. But it just isn't like that, and nor is it really like that for any of us. We all have our stories, we all have our hang-ups, we've all had our tough times, and I'm kind of interested, as I look back over my 58 years of life, that why I'm doing what I do, and it's just become more and more interesting, really. And I was asked in July to go and speak to the Exec MBA group at Aston University as part of their summer school. And this subject came up. And I kind of said to Aston, well, you know what, a lot of people I coach really struggle when they get to the top of their game, and suddenly they're asked to not do what they've been good at anymore. They're asked to do the how, the leadership stuff. In fact, they're kind of, many folk who I've been coaching are a bit paralysed because everything that's made them successful, suddenly they have to delegate or move along and kind of take up this, what can I say, a kind of overseeing role where you have to role model all these behaviours that you're not even sure if you've got, and it leads to a bit of crisis. And I kind of thought, well, you know what, it's not that much dissimilar to parenting, actually, because as the children grow up, you almost have to stand back and maybe be wiser and know more, but let people learn as well. So I kind of said to Lily, well, how about if I come and give the same kind of talk on a webinar, which I have to say feels very weird because I'm used to having that people interaction, but I'm going to go for it and see how it lands with you. The three subjects I'm going to kind of end up focusing on, I'll tell you now, that Lily's been kind enough to allow me some future slots to talk those three subjects through, and those subjects are psychological safety, emotional intelligence, and compassionate leadership. And you'll find out during my talk why I think you can't have one without the other two. They're all inextricably linked. So I'm going to start really just telling you my story. So this is my story, like Lily alluded to. I spent years not enjoying work, and I love the fact Lily mentioned the word authenticity right there, right in the introduction, because at 10 years old, I was told I was too thick, actually, to even sit an 11 plus, let alone fail it. So I was kind of, I was put into a box at that time. I didn't realise it, but I was. And that led, interestingly, to my parents deciding that probably the best place I could go was where my sister had gone through a passion of hers, and that was to ballet school. So I tootled off to ballet school full time. I danced 3 hours a day from the ages of 10 to 17. And my real passion was actually horses. But interestingly, I turned out to be rather good at ballet, and I won a scholarship to be taught by Royal Ballet teachers as well. And it just kind of felt, well, I was just going to have to keep doing that, because I clearly had recognised I didn't have any IQ. So I developed knowledge of sense and feel, through the dance, through the riding. I didn't really develop the think do stuff that I realised in later years were required much more of in work. But I've developed a deep sense of sense and feel. And all was going quite well till I got to 17, and it was before Darcy Bustle's day, and they wanted ballerinas to be very tiny in those days, not 5'7" like Darcy is. So I didn't actually get any further. That was it. The door was shut. And in those days, there wasn't the sort of smorgasbord of dance opportunities. If you didn't do ballet, that was it. You were out of the dance world. So interestingly, I kind of ended up at 17 exactly the same place I'd been when I was 10, because I had no IQ still, apparently. And I was told that I had two choices. One was to learn to type to music, actually, with a manual typewriter, and or be a hairdresser. So I quite like the idea of typing to music, having danced a lot, so I took that option, and I became a copy typist. And in my evenings, I did cleaning work, and that's the only job I've ever been sacked from, because I couldn't hoover in straight lines like a cricket pitch. So my first sort of rub with seniority and status in office life was only ever being asked to make the tea and do the photocopying, and doing a cleaning job where I couldn't hoover the MD's office in lines like a cricket pitch, and I got sacked for it. So I had a fairly dim view of what office life was going to be like, and to be honest, I hated sitting all day. I hated being indoors all day. So I really didn't enjoy it. I skived a lot. I pulled a lot of sickies, and I kind of did everything I could to spend as little time there as possible while earning enough money to pay for a bedsit. So life went on, and you have to earn, so I did. And about 6 years later, I ended up temping in London at the store that's still there. It's called Lily White's in Piccadilly Circus. And I ended up in the personnel office, and the personnel manager there sort of sat me down one day and she said, "Hilary, you've got way more about you. I really think you should do an evening class in your personnel exams." So that was the first time since I was 10 that I thought, my God, somebody's actually seeing something in me I was definitely told I didn't have. I was fairly petrified that I'd get to this blooming college and find out I definitely didn't have it. And it would be very shaming and embarrassing again, because I'd already kind of covered that up for many years. However, she seemed to think it was a good idea, and I trusted her. So I'm just going to take a moment there of the huge amount of power and influence we have in life just by just by saying those couple of sentences to somebody. if she hadn't said them, I've often wondered who would have done and when. So sort of lesson one that I've taken through life is don't be afraid to share your inner thoughts, because you might actually change somebody's life by an observation you have. So bless her, I'm still in touch with her, and she sent me off to college, and I did eventually get my CIPD, or something else it was called then, I can't remember, it's so long ago. In the meantime, I'd become a single parent, and that just became too difficult. And I found myself eventually not being able to work because of the poverty trap of benefits, and really just not knowing what to do. And I'll be totally honest with you, trying to live on £60 a week with one small 2-year-old, there was no choice but to moonlight. I went and worked in pubs for cash as a barmaid, and tried to get friends to babysit, so I didn't have to pay for it. So I was back having discovered a bit of IQ, that I had a bit of it. I then found I couldn't use it because I was stuck in this position where I couldn't work and afford childcare. So again, it makes me very angry when I hear people sort of chastising people on benefits, because that's a place I would never want to go back to. And I think it's probably why I'll continue working way beyond my retirement age, for the fear of ever being that poor again. But I was learning so much at this time. I'd had to move to another part of the country. I was living up in Pontefract in South Yorkshire, and I was really learning a lot about, having been to ballet school, to working in London, to then having to live somewhere in the country where I could just afford to be, living on benefits. Oh my goodness, it was really I was learning a lot about life, although I may have preferred not to have been at the time. But I think what I was also learning was about people's acceptances when they're in tribes, because when I was living in a different place to where I'd been brought up, I was not accepted, even though I was in the Straits. I was. So I learned a lot about tribes in that sense, and how little we accept just by an accent, a voice. So that's the other thing I've taken with me, how punishing it was to be called a foreigner when I was standing behind a bar because I didn't have a northern accent and it was a very working class area. So that was another harsh lesson learned, maybe from the opposite side of the fence than most receive it. But all this this rolling stone was gathering a lot of moss in terms of knowledge. So if you'd like to press the button, Lily, and we'll see what comes next. And as I went into work, again, because I managed to get in through a lovely system on the benefits called family credit, where you could go and work a certain number of hours a week and still get some of your benefits. I went into the NHS. I started as an assistant personnel administrator, and to cut a very long story short, I worked all my way up to director level. Wow, that was an education. Strategic health authorities, general practice, acute hospitals, teaching hospitals. I kind of did the lot over 20 years. And I met the most amazing GP in the Cambridge area, but I won't name him. And when I was working for him, he was saying, Hilary, you know what? Once you let the genie out of the bottle, it'll never go back. So that was when I started to think, you're the second person in my life who's seen this. So there's something there I'm just not getting. But we did quite a lot of work in that role that I did with him around developing the health service in a way it didn't really want to go. And we were quite cutting edge and upset quite a lot of people, but I was fairly used to that by then. In fact, I probably didn't want to be in a job where I didn't upset people. So that kind of went off and created some writing that I was lucky enough to have published way back in the early 2000s. And then I went on to work then I thought I'll go into the private sector because I couldn't imagine working for the Department of Health or government. So I opted out and I went to work for a huge global and energy company. And as we approached the recession in 2011, with my HR hat on and my pride in sort of sticking with employment law, I carried out 3 reorganisations to reduce headcount and, as the board would have put it, get the war chest ready for the recession. They could see it coming and they needed a war chest, and I had the job of making an awful lot of people redundant. And I did that for 12 months, and I got the name the Angel of Death by making those redundancies. If I just turned up anywhere, they go, oh, the Angel of Death's here. Well, who's going? Wasn't really what I'd had in mind when I joined personnel and HR. And at the end of it, so we're kind of talking about 2011 now, the board congratulated me for no disciplinary, no grievances. They applauded me for no employment tribunal claims. You know, I'd hit the mark and got them the money back. But I just kind of looked around and thought, well, I thought employment law was the best place, the sort of knight in shining armour place. But actually people were so demotivated and so switched off, and often them unwell, in all honesty, that I actually decided I wanted to rebrand, that I was more interested in the psychology of work than the employment law part, which I absolutely uphold, but one needs to come with the other. It needs to be balanced, and it felt like a skill that wasn't talked about enough. It felt that people had become a commodity at some point between the change from personnel to HR in my profession. So I think what was maybe courageous, some have called it stupid at the time, but I actually gave up work for a year. And I went to do a master's at City University in organisational psychology. And I was older than most of the lecturers, and was certainly a lot older than most of the other students. But I realised during that incredible year, doing that at 50 was just the best way to not only rebrand, but really find me. So a third lesson, don't ever be put off, or don't let anyone be put off by going back to education late in life. I came back into work for a short period of time with Network Rail after I'd done my master's, and I was working in talent. They had a big behavioural change push on around safety. They needed to stop accidents in work happening on the rails. And I was lucky enough to work with a clinical psychologist called Dr. Martin Newman, who's very well known for his work around emotional intelligence. I spent probably 2 years. He came in from outside, I was the inside contact at Network Rail, and we did a huge amount developing an appreciation of emotional intelligence, especially in terms of safety, how people make decisions. And that was me on fire then. That was really where I'd found my mojo. So 5 years ago, I decided I was going to be self-employed. And I saw myself as being self-employed in emotional intelligence because that's what I felt I really got. I'd done my master's in resilience, emotional intelligence, felt it fitted so well. But actually, and Lily, you can just press a key, or 2 or 3 actually. What I've noticed in the last 5 years as I've been consulting, coaching, team coaching, is that actually to have an environment where you can work confidently and feel safe and be able to be candid, you first of all need psychological safety. If you have psychological safety, you've got some opportunity to develop emotional intelligence. But often people get emotional intelligence intellectually and cognitively, but can't make that behavioural shift in dialing up what they do well, or maybe dialing down what they do well if it's gone into overdrive, unless they can develop some compassion for themselves and, in all likelihood, turn down the self-critic. And it puzzles me why I never understood that, because I'd absolutely grown up with that self-critic heavy on my shoulder. You know, I'd had that on my shoulder from 10 years old, and I still had an imposter syndrome issue going on. And over the last 5 years, while I've been fascinated by each one of these three, I realised that there's an ongoing relationship between them in order for any one of them to flourish. And that's kind of what I'm talking to companies about now and running programs on. So I thought I'd like to share a little bit about those three subjects, if you wouldn't mind clicking the button again, Lily. So psychological safety, it's actually starting to get out there a bit. You may, if you're on Twitter or LinkedIn, you may see stuff posted by Professor Amy Edmondson from Harvard University. Bless her heart, she was researching this way back when, sort of when I, in the 80s and 90s. And as a research assistant, she was really puzzled by the fact her professor asked her to go out and find what made the top teams perform best. And when she discovered who the top teams were, was completely puzzled by the evidence showing they reported way more errors in their work than those that failed. She actually thought she got all her research wrong and re-evaluated it. But it appears that the teams that have a candid environment, one where they can be open, and in her words, and I'll quote her, have a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes, actually means that there will be more errors reported. There will be more failing fast. So ironically, while she didn't originally even believe her own research, that's a sign of there's good relationships going on. And when I say, why does it matter? I don't know anyone. I mean, I can't really see the responses here, but when I stand in front of an audience of 80, I just see people nodding when I say, so guys, you know, how often have you sat in a meeting and thought, oh, I know what I'm going to say. I'll say it in a minute. I think I'm going to say it. Maybe it won't land. Oh, the moment's gone. We have such a sort of better safe than sorry hard wiring in our systems that we have to have an extraordinary environment that will encourage us to be candid, even in a moment when we may be saying something that perhaps we've had an experience that makes us think it might be career limiting. So I'm fascinated by Amy Edmondson's work, and the why does it matter? Well, that really links strongly with, again, if you haven't read about it, Google's Project Aristotle, they called it. That's got a lot more publicity than Amy's work, but they went out to look for what makes a good team great, thinking it would definitely be about IQ. They genuinely believed if they tracked those that had the highest IQ at recruitment, they would find teams, if they put them all together, would work brilliantly. They didn't. Then they thought, oh, well, it's got to be about gender. It wasn't. Then they thought it's about race. It wasn't. So they kept on digging and they kept on doing research, and they came up with a number of factors for sure. But actually, none of those mattered without the psychological safety environment and culture to glue them together. And they hadn't expected this, and they didn't know what to call this glue. And it was then that they started to find Amy Edmondson's work and were able to give it the title she'd recognised some 10 years earlier, psychological safety. Some people now call it safe conflict, because it's the ability to speak up without that heightening of breath and anxiety and quickening of pulse and sweaty palms. And it requires a certain kind of leadership, as you can imagine. You may be thinking now, do I know a leader like that? Have I ever met a leader like that? And if I have, how do they make me feel? And if you have, you'll know exactly that they resonate with you as a mammal, which is what we are. We're humans, we're 21st century, we've got brains different from anything else on the planet, which we'll talk about in a minute. But actually, yeah, we still need to be able to understand that connectivity and emotional trust. So let's talk a bit about that. Do you want to just press the button? There are 3 things. Feel free to press the other 2, Lily. So what can we do about it as leaders? I think there's one more. Is there one more? Yes, that's the one. So 3 tiny little tips, which we will dive into in much more depth in the session just about psychological safety. But one is to set a stage, and that's not just as the kind of top-down leader from the age of the Industrial Revolution that runs more on ego than emotional connection. Setting the stage is, and as a parent, I would say this as well, setting the stage is also showing vulnerability in the high possibility that you don't have the answer all on your own, that you might not be able to tell people, actually, this is going to be a group task, and for the best outcome, it has to be a group task. And to get that input, you have to invite engagement in a way that if you think you have a team that maybe 40% of them might be up for telling you what they're really thinking, trying to use techniques to heighten that bar to 50% or 60% of those innovative ideas. Chris Boardman, the cyclist with Sky, who did all that design for the 2012 Olympics, he says, always never ask a cyclist how to redesign a bike, because if you know anything, you're unlikely to come up with something innovative. And then finally, responding productively. So even if somebody says something which your first thought is that's foolish, maybe respond with, that's interesting, or is there anything else you want to say about it, or can I ask you a question? So you kind of coach them through it. So there are 3 tiny little tips in all of Amy's work, but I thought I'd share them with you today. Lily, feel free to press the button. Now, clearly, if you want to create an environment of psychological safety, you're going to have to get real about whether you've got much emotional intelligence. People often think of IQ as being the currency, whereas actually if you any work by Daniel Goleman or Dr. Martin Newman about emotional intelligence shows we need IQ to get through the gates, because we have to have a certain level. But in terms of leadership and collaboration and energy and motivating people, emotional intelligence is really where potential's at for talent and ongoing development. And that's why it matters, because we don't live in industrial age anymore. We don't have to give instruction in order to make conveyor belts go faster in many businesses. We need to exchange knowledge. Our competitive advantage is in how trusting we are and how quickly we can resolve very complex problems which won't have been solved before. There is no there's no precursor to many problems we face at work and at home. So let's just have a little look at the next layer of what EQ is. You can keep pressing so essentially our emotional intelligence really relies on how good or not we may be at really managing, because we'll never control our emotions, but managing the emotions that come up through our brainstem through 5 senses that have been there since cavemen times. So our first brain, our reptilian brain, is the gateway into all the rest of the brain. So road rage, everyone's felt it, haven't they? Sometimes you're having road rage and sometimes you don't even know you're having it. Sometimes you're off the slip road and going around the roundabout and driving off, before you suddenly think, whoa, what hit me there? Your blood's racing, you're incensed. You may have made a rude sign at the other driver. You may have slammed your brakes on just to say, get off my tailgate. That's the reptilian brain in full flow. It's there for survival, folks, so I'm not saying we don't need it, but what happens is if we only react to that rather than notice it's happening and then wait a moment while we use our mammalian brain, the prefrontal cortex, where we have the gift of being rational and logic, that's when we can bounce the thought back to the reptilian brain and rebalance it, okay? And people think that in our 21st century brain we have a choice and we don't need to behave in that reptilian way. We actually don't have a choice. We just have to learn to recognize it and know it and do our best to deal with it in the moment so we can be more intelligent. I keep talking about the mammalian brain because actually as mammals, the second thing that will really spark a reaction is connection or lack of connection with our fellow human beings. That's so deeply entrenched in us for survival. Whether it's hunting, gathering or nurturing, the connectivity with people, we pick up with those neurons in how we're seeing people as we sit down around a meeting room table, or when the kids come in from school and we're picking up signs if they've had a good day or not, and them from us. It works both ways. So to not underestimate how much of all that's going on with before you've even kind of maybe thought about how you're going to respond. So I work a lot with people understanding the functionality of the brain and how this moment in time in the world, while there is so much interruption and distraction, how difficult it is for our poor brains that really haven't evolved nearly far enough for us to manage in such a distracted world, how we function to the best of our ability in that space and make really capable, considered decisions rather than maybe the reptilian ones. And as you may be able to imagine, I probably spend more time with males because they are the hunter-gatherer. Self-confidence is high competency in males. The nurturing, empathy, relationship side is high competency in females. And I'm always very sad when I go into teams or organisations where either of them aren't trying to connect with each other's strong competencies. Okay, should we go to the next one? So as I said, I did a lot of work in railway companies, HS2, MTR Crossrail, Network Rail, TfL, do a lot of work with engineers. And if any of you work in engineering companies, you know that because they're engineers and that's their passion, that's their love, they also think in a very linear way. They work in a very linear way. So they could often completely cognitively get, if they were perhaps, let's say, high in optimism as an emotional intelligence competency. So they felt motivated and energized, woohoo, on the kind of cusp of it when they were optimistic. If they were low in empathy, that could be quite frustrating because they might be missing out a lot of relational stuff. And while they might understand that, it seemed that a lot of what stopped that was by them being able to first be kind to themselves and allow a little bit of slack. So that was, and when I talk to them about being compassionate, that everyone sort of springs to mind, they're going to have to go around and hug everyone. Do you know what? It's way lighter than that. It's about an intent, just an intent of being compassionate to self, to others, to clients, to stakeholders. And actually, the rub of it is when we're compassionate, we can be way more courageous and ask way more candid questions without that emotional spark of conflict. And that's why it matters, because that's where things like moving the apartheid regime in South Africa, that's what kept them in those talks. When we talk about the Good Friday Agreement, that we're all terrified of going backwards at the moment, that's what compassion really is. It's a strength enough to get you through judgment and see you out the other side. So you may be seeing now how psychological safety, emotional intelligence and compassion all gel to create this extraordinary powerhouse of leadership, whether parenting or leading a business, running a business. So Lily, if you'd like to press the next one, I'm conscious of time. So when I work through compassionate leadership, and this is really work I'm pulling over from the clinical world of psychology into the organisational world at the moment. Professor Paul Gilbert started the movement for therapy, but I'm now working with him and two other clinical psychologists to really kind of bring this into the working world, because there's way too many examples of people buckling under stress, their well-being not being able to maintain. And I know I've had 5 coaching clients in the last year who've all needed some therapeutic support, and that wasn't happening 5 years ago. It's getting worse, not better. So this little element of it, allowing you to be compassionate to yourself, but in order to build further courage and strength, is really starting to sort of create a lot of excitement. So Lily, do you want to press the next one? And how it works is, there'll be a few more, I think, 3 more presses, 1 more. And how back one, I think. We've exploded. So if in the work we do, you know, if we're sort of building EQ over here, but we need a bit of compassionate mind training over here, and then to create the psychological safety in teams, how it works is 3 little simple Buddhist-based elements. The first is to notice how you're feeling, what's going on, those very basic reactions of heightened heart rate or churning guts that we get when we're under threat or stress. And rather than run away from it immediately and try and do something about it, take a moment to think about the choices we have in how we react and respond. And as we make those choices, and the more proficient we get at this, the quicker we can do it. Literally, you can do it in meetings, when you're up against people, whatever. The most important bit is when you've taken your choice, you take responsibility for it. You don't look at the other person and look for blame. You know, you carry that responsibility all the way through, even if it's to a point of disagreeing. So this isn't about everyone having a big love-in. This is about being able to candidly, respectfully, on an adult-to-adult basis, reach the best decisions with understanding, if not agreement. And that creates an absolute powerhouse, whether it's in families. And I have 4 children, 2 stepchildren, 1 of my own and 1 of ours. So I know all about family difficulties, believe you me. But most of all, and that's where my passion is, at work. And I just want to get out there and share it, because it works. And while the E word, emotions, I would have been laughed out of a boardroom 5 years ago. A lot of hostility talking about emotion. Now I'm getting calls about it, and now they're perfectly happy to even explore what the C word is, compassion. And that's it, Lily.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Hilary, and thank you so much for sharing kind of the key areas that kind of feed into kind of psychological safety, emotional intelligence, and compassionate leadership, and how to work with your team a lot better. So I've written down lots of notes, and I've got lots of takeaways. But I was wondering, we've got 8 minutes, and I was wondering if anyone's got any questions for Hilary. Carol?
Yep.
Yes, Carol?
What do you mean by candid? You've used that word a lot, and I would like your definition of candid.
It's being able to speak honestly, but without a sense of having to be confrontational. So to kind of take the more courageous route of, rather than spotting a kind of something, let's see, a criticism, right? So rather than bringing criticism, explaining why you understand that position, but actually I need to say what I'm seeing here. So it's that. I mean, actually, I might just Google it while you're on the line, Carol, to get the authentic words. But for me, it's about being truthful. There we go, truthful, straightforward, and frank. And emotional intelligence, the words behind it include forthright as well. But being straightforward without an emotional barb is often something that's quite hard for mammals with our human brain to do easily. So it takes some training. Does that help?
Yep.
So, Hilary, to kind of train the brain, so to kind of calm the signals that the is this correct, reptilian brain?
Yes. Yeah.
So how would you what tip or advice would you give to start training that reaction?
I mean, that's a lovely question, Lily, because I'm often up in front of loads of men, because I work in a very male dominated industry that generally do loads of triathlons and marathons and Uber marathons, whatever they're called, and they'll sort of go, well, what's this training the brain? And I kind of say, well, you know what, if you were going to do a marathon, you would, you'd probably have a training program, and you'd probably think about nutrition and blah blah blah. But ultimately our habits are embedded in our neurological pathways, but the plasticity of the brain, and MRI scans show this now, that if we're willing to do reps the way you would at a gym, or clock up miles the way you would for a marathon, if we practice putting ourselves in a less comfortable space and challenging the way we react, so developing new behaviours, the evidence shows it takes about 60 reps to create a new neurological pathway. And we can create new neurological pathways to the point where we don't even have to know we're doing it. We all get out of bed and remember how to walk. We all know how to get dressed. So we can do this, and people are just not used to thinking that we can train our brain in the same way. But we absolutely can, and it's about choice, understanding the choices and then choosing them.
Okay, so I guess when we're all driving in our car and we're stuck in traffic or a tractor, it would be a quite good way to train the brain and not react to that.
I guess it's also about, and I'm careful with the word not and don't, because actually part of the compassionate view of it is be kind to yourself if you don't notice till afterwards you've done it. But noticing is the first step. So it's kind of, aha, I think I know what I did then. Next time I'm going to try and interrupt that process and be a better self.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions for Hilary?
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
So one thing I really resonated with me is that when you touched on compassionate leadership, and when you pointed out the three kind of areas: courage, strength, and kindness, which I thought was great, because typically when you talk about leadership, it's always about kind of leading others. But I guess from how I interpreted it, your perspective is kind of more inward, taking courage in yourself, finding that inner strength, and being kind to oneself. So do you have any further thoughts on that? Because I think as a leader, we can be really harsh on ourselves when we get things wrong, or quite open to, people kind of criticizing and whatnot. So what can you recommend to us, those who are leading people or in teams, how to kind of inject that into our kind of day-to-day living, in and out of the workplace?
Well, everybody's different. So we're all seeing life from a different hilltop. Carol's absolutely right. The way our physiology gives us clues all the time, we've just become too used to quashing that. So the interpreting how your body's working, if you get a dry mouth before you go into the boardroom, it's because your body believes you're going to have to run or fight fairly quickly, and therefore you don't need your digestive system at the moment. That's why we get a dry mouth. But if having noticed we've got a dry mouth and we have a drink and we don't then practice some deep breathing from the belly to tell our bodies actually it's okay, and engage that parasympathetic nervous system, that's the sort of animal way of rebalancing. But we do so much from our head. You know, we tend to spend a lot of time in think and do now, whereas actually if you're not preempting that with sense, feel, think, do, and keeping the cycle even, that's tricky. And I just saw, Carol, you put up a question about explain the title. Yeah. So it's called that because I'll just at the beginning of the talk, I mentioned that a lot of folk get into a point of promotion where they're asked to step away from the doing part of their job and be a leader. And that often is a very difficult point for them because all their credibility, everything about them is associated with the doing. So the do less and lead more, actually, it appears from my clients a very difficult thing to achieve unless they get some explanation about what their self-critic might be telling them at that moment, and then probably telling them to do more and hurry up about it. And what are they doing sitting about thinking and sensing and feeling? Does that make sense?
Thank you, Hilary. Thank you so much. I think we will wrap it up. It is 1 o'clock now. Thank you so much for sharing your nuggets of wisdom with us. I'm really looking forward to your next sessions where you'll take a deeper dive into these areas. So on the screen that I shared with you all, we have got the next dates for Hilary's talk. So if you're interested in psychological safety and gaining more insight into this, Hilary is doing a webinar for us on the 3rd of December, 12 till 1. So that's like psychological safety, the key to high performing teams. On the 6th of February, Hilary is running an online webinar on the importance of emotional intelligence at work. And again, she touched on that today. So if you want to kind of take a deeper dive into that, do book onto that. And once again, thank you very much for your time, Hilary, for giving us a wonderful talk on do less and lead more.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.